Afternoon, everyone. It looks like there's still a bunch of people joining, but it is a couple of minutes past 12 now, so I'm going to introduce, get things going. Let me just make sure my microphone is on. So firstly, just a very warm welcome to today's webinar, proudly hosted by Kuda. It's really great to see such a strong turnout. It speaks to just how important this topic is for all of us involved in the equine industry. As you know, African horse sickness remains one of the most significant challenges we face in South Africa, not only from an animal health and welfare perspective, but also in terms of its impact on movement, trade, and the broader equine economy, and certainly including insurance, of course. We're very privileged today to have South African Equine Health and Protocols team, SAEHP, with us. Their work sits at the heart of protecting and enabling our industry, and I'd like to thank them for making time to share their knowledge and insights with us. Today is about information, collaboration, and practical guidance. We know there's no silver bullet for AHS, but by staying informed, working together, and supporting sound protocols, we give ourselves and our horses the best chance. Thank you very much for joining us. We really value your participation, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the various presentations. So please send your questions as we go. You'll see there's a chat section and a Q&A section at the top of your screen, or there should be. Please use the Q&A section to drop any questions. I'm almost certain we're not going to have enough time to answer all the questions that could come up in a session like this. We'll do our best to prioritize which questions to ask and to get answered live at the end of the session, but we'll also commit to answering all questions and circulating a document after the webinar with questions and answers. The webinar itself will also be recorded, and is already being recorded, and we'll distribute this via the website and our various social media channels as soon as possible. So with that, let me not waste any more time, and let me hand over to Adrian Todd, CEO of SAHP, to kick things off. Thank you. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Vian. And just to reiterate your words there, thank you to everybody for joining. And I hope that today, from an SAEHP side, we can put across a bit of information about our background, who we are, and how we fit into the African horse sickness control and risk mitigation strategy for South Africa, and just explain in a bit more detail the current control strategies and risk assessment. I hope you can all see the presentation that is up there, and I'm joined by Dr. John Gruer and Dr. Camilla Vaya. And once we get through this presentation, as Vian said, there'll be plenty of time, or there will be time to answer questions, and the ones that we don't get answered or that need more detail, we will, after the webinar, commit to putting that down on paper for distribution. SAEHP, to give you the background, stands for South African Equine Health and Protocols. The organization started operation on the 1st of January 2018, and our role is to complement government services. Now, when I say government services, there's two particular services involved. There's National DALRAD, which is the Department of Agriculture, and there's Provincial Veterinary Services. In this case, there's Western Cape Veterinary Services. The reason it falls under Western Cape Veterinary Services is the control zones are within the Western Cape. Now, we'll get into a bit more detail about the control zones, but the way that it's structured is that SAEHP officials are all authorized state veterinarians. So in the course of their official duties, they report directly to State Vet Boland, which is Western Cape Provincial Veterinary Services, and to the National Director of Animal Health, which is the Department of Agriculture as it is now. So we've got a bit of a graph up here, a family tree if you want to call it that just explains a bit about how the various organizations interact and how they're connected. I'm not going to go through every single part of the graph here, but needless to say, it's integrated, and that is how it's structured in South Africa. that we implement the veterinary procedural notice on behalf of the national and provincial authorities. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Gruer now, who is going to start to walk you through a bit more about the disease and the current risk mitigation and control measures in place, the reasons therefore, and how that impacts and affects people in their day-to-day business. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So yeah, my name is John Gruer. I'm a specialist epidemiologist working with South African Equine Health and Protocols. And myself and Dr. Camilla Bayer is also on this call, who will be joining us for the question session as well, and she'll introduce herself then. We sort of the vets that are heading up the technical and sort of logistics team at SIAP. Just in terms of African horse sickness, all of us in Africa or South Africa are close to specialists regarding this disease, but for what it's worth, for those of you that are maybe not less familiar, it's a life-threatening disease of horses. It's one of the only listed diseases where the World Organization for Animal Health allows countries to say that they're officially free. It's the only equine disease where WOAs indicate that. And it's a trade restricting disease of equids. So it has a big impact on trade. And many of you will be aware of that, especially from South Africa's perspective. There's infectious disease, but it's not contagious. So there's no direct transmission from horse to horse. It requires a michi or a midge to transmit the disease from horse to horse. It's generally endemic in most of Africa, if not all of Africa. Except right in the north of the Sahara Desert. So I'll show you a map now. And really the distribution of the disease is very, very closely linked to the populations of horses, zebras, and donkeys in Africa. The vector, so the midge and where it's distributed, and the ecology that makes that midge distribution viable. And then both of these things are very closely linked to environmental factors. So weather patterns and seasonal patterns. And so it's it is an interesting disease when it comes to sort of this complexity between animals and vectors. In terms of where African horse sickness isn't in the global context, the disease is considered free on most of our continents, except for Africa. So most countries that have applied for freedom outside of Africa have obtained freedom from African horse sickness. The countries that are grey on that map that are not in Africa either don't have animal health services that allow them to show that they're free officially, but they probably are scientifically free anyway. But certainly Africa is the biggest hit continent in terms of the disease, where, as I said, only some of our northern neighbors, the Egypts and Moroccos of the world, are considered officially free from African horse sickness. Certainly no country in sub-Saharan Africa can be considered free at the moment. There have been some outbreaks outside of Africa. It doesn't happen often. There's some big outbreaks in the 1960s, and the late 1980s and early 1990s. But more recently, there was an outbreak in 2020 in Thailand, and to a lesser degree in Malaysia. I'm not going to discuss the Malaysian component. It was a really bit of a strange case and not scientifically a great example of an outbreak. But in Thailand, there was certainly a proper outbreak of the disease. That little graph on the slide there shows the cases over time. So they had an outbreak that lasted from February 2020 as lockdown was starting with COVID, that sort of spiked in March and April, and then eventually their last cases were reported all the way down the line in September, and they had a total of 568 deaths in their population of horses. They did put massive control measures in during the outbreak, and still had that high number of deaths. And so from our perspective, it was interesting to see an outbreak that occurred in a non-endemic part of the world. The numbers that are important for us in South Africa are, it was a good opportunity to get an idea of what proportion of animals actually get infected if there is an outbreak. The Thais did vaccinate, but obviously there's a bit of a lag between when you can start vaccinating, when you find out that you've got an outbreak, and when you can start vaccinating. But depending on what population number you consider, because there were a couple of different numbers that were being used, but the percentage of horses that got affected in that outbreak is somewhere between 7.5% and 22%. So actually quite a similar level to what we see when we get African horse sickness in our controlled area in South Africa. And then the mortality rate was somewhere between 4% and 20%. And so, but the case fatality rate, it was 93%. So that the case fatality rate is different to mortality. Case fatality is the percentage of horses that had African horse sickness and died, whereas a normal mortality rate is just the number of deaths that occurred in the whole population. So the number that really worries people when it comes to horse sickness outside of Africa is that case fatality rates, where if your horse gets horse sickness, there's a high chance of it dying. In South Africa, our endemic case fatality rate is around about 50%. So our data's not as good as sort of a short-term, well-looked-at outbreak like the Thais, but our best estimate in South Africa is a case fatality of about 50%, considering that we've got a large population of vaccinated horses. So in Thailand, definitely the horse was the primary species that was affected, but the source of that outbreak was from zebra that we imported from Southern Africa. And so why I put that slide on is just to show the impact of the disease outside of Africa, and why we don't belittle countries where they say they're worried about horse sickness, because we know that it does have quite a big consequence for these countries. And for Thailand and Malaysia, given that they had outbreaks in 2020, they only got their reinstatement of freedom from the World Organization for Animal Health in 2023 and 2024. So it has a big impact, not only for locally, for having over 500 deaths and fairly high morbidity and mortality, but the ability for those countries to then trade is very hampered, and it takes a couple of years to return to a free status again. So just to get back to South Africa, what I thought might be interesting is just for you to see some of the trends that we look at and analyze, given the work that we're doing, and then how we control African horse sickness. And then, I mean, given the fact that the webinar is hosted by Kuda and it's linked to insurance, there's also a strong link to risk. And we also, our work is highly risk-orientated work, and a lot of the decisions that are made on policy and control is risk-based. So I thought I might show you some of the risk assessments that we do as an example of that. So our zoning approach in South Africa, we've been zoned for African horse sickness for a long time, since around about 1997. They started the process in 1995, where the national director and the provincial director from the Western Cape got together and put together a paper, which is the one in the top right-hand corner there, which was published in 95, giving a case for why South Africa should be regionalized for African horse sickness. And in that paper, that was largely driven by what they felt was a driver for horse sickness, was the large populations of zebra up near in Kruger Park, and how cases just simply didn't occur that often down in the Cape where we are. And so that regionalization led to zoning. And so in South Africa, if we work from our free zone, we've got a really, really small free zone in Cape Town, which is effectively metropolitan Cape Town. And that zone is effectively to facilitate export. In terms of scientific risk, there's not a major difference between the risk in that zone and the surveillance zone, which is the one zone bigger. And our surveillance, African horse sickness surveillance zone, is sort of bound on the east by Martentot's Holland Mountains, from Somerset West going all the way up north to the dam above Wellington, and then crossing onto the Berg River as the northern boundary all the way to the sea, just north of Langebaan. So that surveillance and free zone, the size of that is determined by EU legislation and sort of how the EU would have controlled African horse sickness should they get it. So we use similar numbers to what their recommendations were. So 50 kilometers as a ballpark. And then we've got outside of that a protection zone, which is sort of another 150 kilometers going east and north from the surveillance zone. So still all in the Western Cape province. And for those of you that have driven into the Western Cape on the N2 or the N1 or the N7 or even the R62, we've got those signboards, big yellow signboards saying that you're entering the African horse sickness control zone. Those signboards are at the boundary of the protection zone. So our protection, surveillance, and free zone make up a African horse sickness controlled area where we have infrequent cases of African horse sickness. And if we do have cases there, it has a big impact on our ability to trade. And then for the rest of South Africa, we consider the rest of South Africa an infected zone. I spoke briefly about climate, and the map on the left of your screen is sort of the climate classification for Africa, and then a bit zoomed in is the South African climate classification. And one of the reasons the zoning works in South Africa is because we've got that large sort of semi-arid band running through between the Western Cape and the rest of the country. And so through the Karoo into the Northern Cape, and that sort of facilitates the prevention of any natural transmission of African horse sickness from the north. And then the Western Cape itself, where our controlled area is, for those of you that live here, we've got a very Mediterranean climate, so really a wet winter and a dry, hot summer. And that is not as conducive to midge ecology as, for instance, KwaZulu-Natal or Kruger Park or those areas is. So these are some of the environmental factors that drive our zoning. And to give you an idea of how bad African horse sickness is in the country, obviously things change from year to year. This little graphic is just a map, is a graphic of every month, how many cases of African horse sickness have been reported by South Africa between 1993 and 2023. So like, what's it, a 30-year period or whatever it is. And in general, looking at that data, we, and taking into some consideration that there might be underreporting, which we know that there would be underreporting. So in our endemic or infected zone, we get about 330 cases for every 10,000 horse years at risk. That number is not that meaningful, but on average, we're looking at about 400 to 500 cases of African horse sickness a year in the infected area in South Africa, with some of these outlier years on the upper and lower end of that scale. And we have worked out that the risk of infection in the infected zone is about 23 times greater than the risk of infection in our controlled area. So there's quite a big discrepancy between the controlled area and the endemic area. So these little graphics are the same graphics, so all the cases in the last 30 years by province. And what we do see, and it's maybe not that clear on this graphic, but we do see that theory of the sort of source of African horse sickness starting up in the northeastern and eastern parts of our country and moving slowly across every season does play out if we look at the sort of large resolution outbreak data. So we do see like Gauteng having cases often earlier sort of in the season than maybe the Eastern Cape would have. But you can also see that you will see the underreporting, like the reporting from Limpopo and Free State is probably not as good as what it is from Gauteng. So we also do caveat the data with that. And then our Western Cape outbreaks, even the infected part of the Western Cape outbreaks are really sporadic. We have very, very few cases in the Western Cape in general, let alone the controlled area. So I think the case for zoning is still very valid and something that is still applicable in 2025. So our outbreaks in our controlled area, again, for those of you that have been here and are horse owners here, this generally makes the news, as it were, in our industry. But we have had a couple of outbreaks since 1999. We've had sort of 8 incursions, as it were, since 1999 in Stellenbosch, twice in Pol, in Malmesbury, near Momray, up in Portugal, and Robertson have had 2 outbreaks, fairly small outbreaks. And then the most recent outbreak was up in Cedarburg, so that blue triangle right in the top northern part of the protection zone. We had 4 properties with a couple of cases in 2021. And so our risk in the controlled area, if you've got a horse in the controlled area, the risk of African horse sickness is around about 14 cases for every 10,000 horse years at risk. So if you have 10,000 horses, the risk is about 14 cases in that population in a single year. So it's just dependent on the populations, but it's a fairly small risk of infection, and a lot less than the endemic area. And so our outbreaks have occurred in the controlled area very, very strongly towards the end of summer and into autumn. Our outbreaks are generally fairly short in the controlled area, whether that's because of the seasonal change, because we always end up going into winter or late autumn where midge transmission is very unlikely anyway, or whether it's because we control the disease. We like to think it's because we control it maybe, but it's probably because of the epidemiology of the disease. But our outbreaks last about 2 months They've been as short as 32 days. That was the outbreak in 2016 in Pol, was really short-lived. But they can, we've had outbreaks as long as 73 days in the surveillance zone, 83 days in the protection zone. So it's quite varied. But what is important is that our outbreaks, and this is work that Camilla has done, is that a lot of the outbreaks in the controlled area were as a result of reversion to virulence and reassortment of the live attenuated vaccine that we use. So just in short, our only registered vaccine in South Africa is a live attenuated vaccine. It works incredibly well in terms of herd level protection for African horse sickness. And we can say that fairly confidently based on just simply the number of cases that we have in an endemic country and what it used to be and what it is now. But the downside of a vaccine like that, and it's not only for African horse sickness, is that because they're live attenuated, they can revert back to their original state. And all of these vaccines came from some sort of wild virus at some point in time in their development. And so the other thing that can happen is you can have little parts of the vaccine, the serotypes within the vaccine that can merge with one another and create a virus that's transmissible. So this is a rare event still, but it is something that has happened. And because of that, we now limit vaccination in a controlled area to certain times of the year to try to decrease the risk of this happening. Okay, so what we do in terms of control now, whenever you move a horse from the endemic zone into the controlled area, we classify every part of the country now based on its African horse sickness risk. And we use laboratory data, we use local information from the state veterinarians of the areas, we use data of other diseases that are related to African horse sickness, like equine encephalosis virus. We make use of where areas are. Are they close to Kruger National Park? Are they close to large populations of zebra? And every day of the year, effectively, every part of the country has got some sort of classification. The only exception is where we don't have horses moving from. We don't need to classify those. So all of the sort of white dots on this, or white areas on this map, are just not classified for that period because no horses were moving. But where the areas are red, that means there's the estimate is that there's a high risk of African horse sickness. Where it's purple, it means that there's an uncertain risk, or the risk is in very, very small parts of that area. And so movement may occur, it depends on where horses are moving from. And then the green is where the risk is low and horses can move directly into our controlled area. So we call this our area status declaration system, and it's a risk. So we use a risk-based movement process. And then getting into our movement control, we require a few things now, or the country requires a few things now. so that when horses move into our controlled area, they need to be positively identified, and we use passports for that. And the passports must be filled in by a registered veterinarian, and the passport must also be issued by an approved passport issuing agency. Then within the passport, African horse sickness vaccinations need to be filled in. They have to be entered in by a veterinarian to show that a veterinarian, in fact, performed that vaccination. And then there are rules because of this reversion to virulence and reassortment. We limit the time period when horses can move after vaccination. So they can't move within 40 days of African horse sickness vaccination, and they have to have been vaccinated within the last 2 years. And then a movement permit is issued after an application by a member of the public, and that movement permit is issued by State Vet Boland on behalf of the state vet, effectively at origin. And before that horse moves, a private veterinarian has to do a health check that the horse is healthy to move, and that there's no indication that infectious disease might be present. And that health check must be notified to State Vet Boland as well, and that health check must take place within 72 hours of movement. And so we use these measures to try, firstly, have a good idea of what horses are moving and where they're moving from, and then to put risk mitigation in place. So if horses move from a high-risk area, for instance, there are processes where they can move through a quarantine protocol, stopover quarantine protocol, they're vector-protected stopover quarantine protocols, or they can move to a low-risk part of the country. So there are options for horses that are coming from high-risk areas during like this time of year when a lot of the country will be high risk. So we, in general, around about 4,000 horses a year move into our controlled area, and we issue about 2,000 permits a year for those movements. And then because of Camilla's work on this reversion to virulence, the vaccination of horse sickness is also controlled in the controlled area. So the general requirements for that are that vaccination is not permitted in the surveillance and free zone, except with permission by State Vet Boland. And then there are some requirements like passport requirements. There must be a reason why you're vaccinating. Generally, people vaccinate because they need to move their horse into the infected zone and want to protect their animal. That's the general reason for vaccination in the surveillance and free zone. And so there's quite a big process in terms of getting your horse permission to vaccinate. And then even after you've got permission, that vaccination can only be performed during a certain time of the year. That time of the year is generally between 1 June and the 31st of October. That period can change depending on the conditions. So if we have had African horse sickness cases or a very, very warm season or whatever the case might be, that time period can change, but generally it's between 1 June and 31st of October. And then there are rules in the protection zone as well, where vaccination has to be done in the horse sickness protection zone. So that's across the mountains, over the mountains, but so the Robertsons and Ceres and Worcester, those areas. And in the protection zone, vaccination has to be done, but it can only be done between June and October as well. So these rules are simply in place to try to decrease the risk of a vaccine actually becoming a circulating virus and putting horses at risk. Okay, the next type of control that we do is we do a lot of surveillance for horse sickness. And we do, like, we keep track of all the generalistic surveillance. So the map on the right-hand side is we track every sample that's tested for horse sickness in South Africa. We locate to a municipality within the country. And so we know exactly how many horse sickness tests have been done and where they've been done from. And so we keep track of that. But then in our controlled area, in our surveillance zone, we do real targeted active surveillance, where we got a sentinel program where we test in the region of 150 horses using PCR every month from about 50 to 60 different farms. And so that's a program we run as well. And that's to give a more targeted look at showing freedom from disease. And then we do analyze the surveillance as well. And we take into consideration like what the likelihood of a horse that's got African horse sickness will show clinical signs, and how likely that will be observed by a member of the public, and how likely is that the member of the public will call the vet etc., etc. So we do analyze our surveillance and show effectively what's the probability that we're free given the fact that we haven't had any cases. All right, and then we do risk assessment as well. So the first risk assessment that we do is we look at what's the probability that we'll actually get a horse entering the African horse sickness control zone with some African horse sickness RNA in its blood. We don't say it's infectious, but we say it might be. And so we know that in general, the highest risk time of the year for us is in February of moving an uninfected but undetected horse into our controlled area with African horse sickness. And that drops quite strongly down into winter. So we now in April, and we know that by the time we get to April, the risk is getting quite low of actually having an entry of a horse that's got horse sickness. And the good thing about our situation is that the highest risk horses are generally up in Limpopo and close to Kuda National Park, but most of our horses actually move from the Western Cape into the controlled area. So there's a bit of a disconnect between risk, location, and origin of where horses come from. So in that sense, it's our movement system facilitates some risk mitigation as well. And then we also look at risk of, well, if African horse sickness hits our controlled area, what's it likely to look like? So we know what it looks like in reality because we've had outbreaks, but we also do model this and we try to get an idea of if African horse sickness positive horse ended up in Cape Town or in Omanus or wherever it might be, we look at what's the likelihood of that outbreak expanding and how many horses are likely to be affected. And so we do that type of modeling. It's called an exposure risk assessment. And then zebra are an important part of African horse sickness. We do consider them a reservoir host. So they don't carry the disease indefinitely, zebra, but the populations of a place like Kruger National Park mean that horse sickness is likely to occur there endemically and will comfortably circulate because of the number of foals that are introduced into the zebra population. The fact that there's not really a fixed breeding season for wild zebra in the Kruger Park, the fact that there are 30,000 zebra in the Kruger Park allows for this continued endemic sort of situation for zebra in a place like the Kruger Park. But what we model is we look at our populations in the Western Cape and we say, well, is it possible that that can happen in the Western Cape? And the bottom line is it's highly unlikely that we will ever get a persistent infection of African horse sickness in our zebra populations because they're simply too small. There are not enough animals entering the population of zebra that will allow the virus to just continually and calmly circulate, given our weather patterns and given our populations of zebra. So that's another example of the type of modeling that we do, where we consider the real life situation of how our hosts are distributed in South Africa. And then for our trade partners, but it actually was a really good exercise for us as well, we do an export risk assessment. So what's the probability that if we export horses from South Africa, from a place like Kenilworth quarantine station or from the free zone, what's the probability that we will have export African horse sickness undetected in horses? And this was work that was done in collaboration with an Australian consultancy. There are lots of numbers on the screen, but we considered that horses might get infected at different parts of the pathway. So before they enter quarantine, while they're in quarantine, while they're getting transported from quarantine to the aeroplane, there are a whole lot of different places horses can get infected with horse sickness. But the bottom line is we could show that in the current circumstances in South Africa, the risk of us exporting an infected, undetected horse is around about 1 in every 187,000 horses that we export. And that's if we're exporting from a low risk area like Cape Town, and we're using quarantine. So so that was a really important risk assessment for our trade partners. And then finally, we continually try use science to improve our policy. And so this is the most recent example where we've submitted to our national department a use case to say, for vector protected quarantine, can we change the times when horses can exit and enter their vector protected barns in the day, because we had a lot of complaints, from people that where horses underwent their vector protection process, but they spent a lot of time in barns, and they wanted a justification for that. So we look then at how midges feed, when do they feed, does it change from season to season? And so we do a study, it's called a systematic review study with a meta-analysis to show, yes, we think that we can take horses out of stables slightly earlier in the day. That would probably be fine, but we can't change the way that we stable them at night. And so that helps us make some sort of policy. So a lot of the science that we do in SAEHP relates to practical policy changes that we want to drive. And so while the controls of horse sickness are fairly fixed, we continuously trying to improve systems and make sure that it works, but to try sort of maintain a good sort of risk-based approach to what we do. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. It's not the first time I'm seeing that presentation, but I find it very interesting every time. So thanks very much for going through that. Janine is going to be going through some of the questions. There's been quite a few questions online. So handing over to Janine.
Thank you, Vian, and thank you, Adrian and John. Just a few of the questions we've had. As Vian mentioned at the beginning, the questions we don't get to today, Kuda will answer the ones that are related to insurance, and then we'll refer the others to the experts. We'll compile all the answers and then circulate that to everyone afterwards. Okay, so the first question I've got here is, why is it important that a vet administers the African horse sickness vaccine?
Thanks, Janine. I think if Camilla's here, maybe she can join us. If she stays muted for too long, I'll just chime in.
I managed to unmute myself. I can't turn my camera on for some reason. It says there's an error and I have to log out, so I won't try doing that. But
Camilla, I think we've lost you.
Yeah, we've lost Camilla, I think. So I'll just, Janine, I'll just chime in there. So,
Thank you,
because one of the things that's really important is for certification purposes. If you're moving a horse, and one of the components of movement is that vaccination must have been performed at certain times and performed by certain people. The way that we can certify that is if a vet is undersigning that vaccination. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, specifically with African horse sickness, is that the only registered vaccine that we've got is a vaccine that is susceptible to temperature, for instance. So we have to maintain a cold chain with the vaccine, and veterinarians are trained to manage that, and they're trained to understand why those things are important. And so that's one of the major reasons why vets are required to perform that vaccination if that vaccination is used for certification. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then next question, what protocols should be followed if you suspect or have an infected horse at your yard?
Cool. So the most important thing is that legislatively, you have to inform your local state veterinarian. In fact, that's for any infectious disease in your animal, but certainly for African horse sickness, because it's a controlled animal disease. And so the easiest way to do that is to go to your private vet and try to get that information from them. And at least your private vet can also give you some guidance on management of that case. But the bottom line is that information needs to get to the state veterinarian where you're based. You're welcome to contact us if you're not sure who your state veterinarian is, and we can put you in touch with them. We work a lot with them across the country because of those status declarations, and so we're familiar with the state vets. So you're welcome to ask us, and we can try to facilitate that as well. But that is legislatively what has to happen if you suspect a case of African horse sickness.
Then will there be enough African horse sickness vaccinations this year so that all the horses in the infected zones can be vaccinated? And if that's not the case, is there still the possibility of other companies other than OBP producing the vaccine?
I'll answer the first bit of that, and I think Adrian can answer the second bit, if that's okay, Adrian. Yeah, so just in terms of vaccine, obviously we know that there have been some vaccine production issues over the last couple of years, and that there's likely to be a lag phase before we get up to the levels that we would really be comfortable with. But certainly this year there's been some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of what's been available to distributors, so that's been really good. Whether we'll get to the levels of everyone that wants a vaccine getting a vaccine, I'm not sure yet. Adrian, maybe you can comment. You work a bit closer with the distributors and those guys.
Thanks, John. This is a very good question, and it's a very important question. Now, we do know that OBP, as the manufacturer of the only registered vaccine, have undergone some manufacturing challenges. Basically, the biggest problem there was that the freeze dryer wasn't working, and this is a freeze-dried vaccine. That freeze dryer has been replaced. Now, unfortunately, these are not plug-and-play machines, so there is a certain amount of calibration and testing that needs to be done to make sure that they can safely produce the vaccine. That is a work in progress. We are led to believe that that machine is getting calibrated and that things are happening. This affects more than just the equine community and African horse sickness vaccination or vaccine. It affects any vaccine that is freeze-dried. So there's quite a lot of push from, let's say, the red meat industry. Lumpy skin is another disease that relies on a freeze-dried vaccine. The Minister of Agriculture is very aware of these issues, and government is doing everything they can to get it up to speed. Whether that gets to full production before this year's African horse sickness vaccination season starts, I can't commit to either way. And then on to the question about are there other companies that can make the vaccine? We see that's a bit trickier. Now, there is work ongoing regarding new vaccine development, and that is a much longer story. But to get other companies to manufacture the existing vaccine, the problem there is really twofold. One is that whether we like it or not, it's not a huge market. And that is simply the reason why one of the larger international drug companies haven't jumped in and said they would like to develop and manufacture vaccine for African horse sickness. The second thing is surrounding IP, and you'll hear many arguments that the IP should now be made available, etc. That is a discussion between government, a willing manufacturer, and OBP. It's not something that we can give an answer on in this forum about the possibilities of an alternative manufacturer.
Thank you. What is the status of vaccinations in the free and surveillance zones? Do you think people will be able to vaccinate this year?
The intent of government this year is to allow limited vaccination for the purposes of movement. It's important to remember that, as John said in his presentation, that vaccination has always been banned in the free zone and the surveillance zone, and vaccination has been allowed via the issuance of a derogation to that effect. So it's never been a case that you can just go forward and vaccinate. But as I said, the intent this year is to allow for limited vaccination for the purposes of movement to the infected zone.
In the free zone, we are not allowed to vaccinate for horses that compete in and out of the free zone. What is the protocol? For example, timelines of vaccinations, and when will it be safe for the horse to compete?
If Camilla's here, she would be the best one to answer that. Although I think I partially answered it in the previous question. But Camilla, I just saw you. Are you back here?
I hope so.
Yeah, Camilla, you are back.
I don't know. My computer really hates Teams for some reason. So the protocol, horses that are to move out of the controlled area, those are the horses that we would be suggesting do apply for permission to vaccinate if they are in the free and surveillance zone, because they're obviously going to be at risk if they move out of the controlled area. And of course, if they want to come back, we don't want a horse going out and coming back and then posing a risk to our controlled area as well. So those would be the ones that we do consider giving permission to. From a movement perspective, I'm talking movement specifically, you have, as John already did point out in his presentation, you need to have vaccinations within the last 24 months, and they need to be valid. So they need to have been done by a vet, they need to have been done in a passport at the time of vaccination, and they need to be done with valid registered vaccine. So in terms of for a protocol, if you're only doing it for movement perspective, and you're in the surveillance and free zones, vaccination every second year would be sufficient to enable you to move out and move back safely. But you do need to take into account what your, from an insurance perspective, whether your horse would be covered if you're leaving and would be outside of that surveillance and free zone and something goes wrong. And then as well, your competition rules, because for example, SAEF, the Equestrian Federation, their rule is that if you are competing outside of the controlled area, so anywhere outside of the controlled area, you should have vaccinations within the last 12 months. Or actually, it's not even 12 months, it's within the last calendar year. So you need to have a set of vaccinations each calendar year. It's not specifically limited to months. You could potentially have vaccinations in January of 2024 and December of 2025 and still be compliant for competition purposes. But that, with the shortages that we've seen, there have been derogations given on those requirements for competition purposes. So depending on what you're wanting to do from a travel perspective, it is important that you make sure you are up to date with those specific requirements for each individual thing. But from a movement perspective, so from a government and legal perspective and moving in and out of the controlled area, the requirement is every 24 months. If you're not moving out of the controlled area, there isn't actually a requirement for vaccination.
And I think that's an important thing to note what Camilla's just mentioned there, that while the vaccination period when permission is granted is from June until the end of October, that's in the controlled zone. Outside of the controlled zone, there are sometimes other rules and regulations brought in by the body concerned, be it SAEF, be it the National Horse Racing Authority, etc., that are not necessarily aligned with the national regulation. For instance, it is a national regulation recommendation that you stick to that June to October vaccination season in the infected zone. However, for the National Horse Racing Authority horses, it is a requirement.
Yeah, I think it's important just to know from both a racing perspective, from a competition, most of the rules are not actually contradictory. They might just be either slightly more or slightly less onerous than what is in law, but they don't contradict law. So the law is first. Law is first and foremost. You need to make sure you adhere.
Oh goodness!
We've lost you again, Camilla.
Yeah, we've lost Camilla again. Just a quick, questions have been coming in thick and fast towards the end of the session. So the Kuda team is scurrying around trying to go through them. But I see there's a lot of questions about live vaccines versus dead vaccines. We of course have a live attenuated vaccine in South Africa. Maybe just some comments on the differences, and particularly as it relates to, I saw a couple of questions describing horses getting quite sick after having the vaccine. Is that normal? Is that something to expect? And just maybe elaborate on that for us, please.
I think before I let Camilla and John get into the technical details of that, it's important to be cognizant of the fact that there is a lot more to the various types of vaccine than a simple live or dead. We use a live attenuated. When people say a dead vaccine, they generally lump into that category everything that is not a live attenuated vaccine. Probably the closest scientific explanation to a dead vaccine is in an inactivated vaccine. Now, an inactivated vaccine would work extremely well in controlling an outbreak in a non-endemic area. There's a lot of research or trials that would have to be done to conclude that a specific inactivated vaccine would have the necessary durability and efficacy to be used in an endemic zone. And those haven't to date been conducted in South Africa. But John and Camilla, if you want to just give a more technical overview of what people lump into the category of dead vaccine here.
Yeah, sure. I can crack on. If Camilla, just jump in if you want to. So, I mean, the major difference between a live or it's live attenuated and a dead vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine uses a form of the virus that can still replicate. So you get replication in the animal that gets administered the vaccine. Whereas a dead vaccine, the virus particles that are in a dead vaccine are killed and they can't replicate. And so that has implications for how the animal reacts to that vaccine. A live attenuated or a live vaccine, generally you get a stronger, longer lasting immunity, and you get both an antibody response and a cellular immunity generally. So really, really strong immunity. Whereas with a dead vaccine, the focus is mainly on a primary antibody response. It's often weaker than what you would see in a live attenuated vaccine, and it's generally of shorter duration. And so, for instance, our live attenuated African horse sickness vaccine, the current registration is generally annual vaccination, but then you get some vaccines that are dead vaccines that you would see typically vaccination will only occur every, say, 6 months or so. So that would be one of the reasons why you vaccinate more frequently versus a longer lasting effect. And then, but the difference that Camilla's worked on is, of course, this difference in safety where a live attenuated or live vaccine can revert to virulence or reassort, whereas you don't see that in a dead vaccine. So dead vaccines can be considered from that perspective safer. I think that was. Yeah.
I think just to add to, and Camilla can give much more technical detail on this part, but African horse sickness is not just a simple one strain disease. There's 9 different strains of African horse sickness. Now, in vaccines, there is a certain amount of cross protection given between one strain to another, but it's not a simple disease with just one strain of the virus. There's 9 different strains that have to be accounted for or dealt with in the manufacturing and development of any vaccine.
I see the late question, but there was just a specific question about the Dubai vaccine. If to the extent that hasn't been answered yet or covered yet, any comment related to that in particular?
Yes, Vianda, there's an inactivated vaccine that has been developed in Dubai. To my knowledge, it has been used in certain trials in Kenya. It hasn't undergone challenge trials in South Africa or registration. So it would have to go through that process the same as any other newly developed vaccine before it could be legally used in South Africa.
Vian, sorry, the other part of the question that I remembered was asked about this vaccine reactions. You know, what happens if my horse? So if I can quickly answer that, there's a very big difference between a vaccine reaction and this reversion to virulence that we're talking about. A vaccine reaction is when the individual animal responds to the the vaccine from an immune perspective, like due to its immune stimulation or the adjuvant, so the components of the vaccine that stimulate immunity. And so it's generally a mild transient response to the actual vaccine. And so it's the same for us as humans, when we get vaccinated for flu every year. Some people have got no reaction to that vaccine and can continue work as normal. Some people get a transient, might get a fever or some sort of clinical signs that are nothing to worry about. So that's a vaccine reaction. And we know that vaccine reactions with African horse sickness also occur. And generally, they are not something to be too concerned about. And if they happen, they will happen within days of the vaccination getting administered. And if people are concerned about that, they should really contact their veterinarian, because it's a clinical problem rather than a viral problem. Whereas the reversion to virulence is a full-scale infection, effectively. It's a much rarer event, and it results in actual replication of a changed virus within the animal and is likely to spread. A vaccine reaction won't spread between horses. It's that individual's response, whereas a reversion to virulence or reassortment would be something to be concerned about. That would occur much later than just a few days after vaccination. Camilla, is that about sum it up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the real risk that we have of horses getting sick, in inverted commas, post-vaccination is normally in first-time vaccinates. So we often see it in imported horses that are vaccinated for the first time and have no innate immunity, having not been born in South Africa. And oftentimes we do see horses that get sick post-vaccination with nothing to do with African horse sickness, but they've got something like pyroplasmosis, which is like the horse version of tick bite fever. And now you've gone and vaccinated them. And if you had vaccinated them with anything, because you're putting a mild strain on their immune system, they then become sick. And because people aren't testing properly, they just assume it's the vaccine that's the problem. They're not actually treating the cause. It's something, when I worked in Joburg as a normal equine clinical vet, we saw it often, that you'd vaccinate against flu or African horse sickness, and a week later, the horse starts to get sick with fevers and whatnot. Client is absolutely convinced that it is the vaccine, when in fact it has got chronic biliary and which hasn't been treated, and now because you vaccinated, you're getting this this recurrence of fever and whatnot. So it's important that if you do see those sort of things, that you get it properly investigated.
And given the nature of this forum as well, it's important to also be cognizant of the other risk mitigation measures that you can take apart from vaccine. This is not a contagious disease that is spread from one horse to another. It's spread by a midge, as John said at the very beginning. So midge control and midge mitigation measures are also important.
That was going to be my next question, Adrian. We've had quite a few questions regarding what can we practically do in terms of control measures to try and prevent your horse getting African horse sickness.
Camilla's actually got a document on that, so over to you, Camilla.
So that is like an entire presentation all on its own, and I think I did share with you guys, with Kuda, the documents that government has put together with us. We've helped them put that together, as with a couple of other people that are experts in the fields. We've got some nice links to presentations that have been done. One of them was we did for Thailand, so that we could give them some background. But I mean, the basic thing is, if your horse is going to get African horse sickness, you want it to be starting from a good health perspective. So basic things like making sure your horse is dewormed, making sure your horse is vaccinated against other things, making sure your horse has not got ticks, and is not a risk for having chronic pyro, would help it in the long run if it got any disease, let alone African horse sickness. And then other things like limiting the amount of exposure. As we know, as John said, it's not something that a horse can get from horse to horse. The horse has to have been bitten by the michi or the midge in order to get African horse sickness. So limiting exposure to the midge is another way. It's all of these things are not going to be foolproof. They're not going to be the magic bullet that ends the disease, but it's a tiered approach to stopping exposure of the horse to the virus. So the one is building on the immune system, be it through vaccination, be it through a healthy horse. The others are limiting the midge thing, which you can do with insecticides on the horse, repellents on the horse, insecticides in their housing, ensuring the breeding areas for midges are as low as you can possibly get them. It's not always possible to eradicate them completely. And then other things like decreasing stress. So if you've got a horse that's immune system's a little bit down, if your horse is down, don't go take it to that horse show where it might be exposed to other horses that, or to midges that have been infected with African horse sickness. Don't take a horse that might, because of the area you're in, and it might be subclinically infected with African horse sickness, and then you go and do a 40K endurance ride, and that just pushes it over the edge. So it's a whole management protocol that you have to put in place to try and ensure that your horse isn't going to get African horse sickness. And it's probably going to be one of those things that you almost have to take day by day.
Thank you, Camilla. Then we've also had a few questions around the quarantine centers. So basically where they are and how they are monitored to be compliant. And what is the reason for horses having to go via quarantine? And those, yeah, if you can perhaps elaborate a little bit about that.
So by quarantine stations, I'm not sure whether they mean specifically for exports or whether they're meaning for internal movements in South Africa. For exports at the moment out of the country, there is only one quarantine station currently registered, and that is at Kenilworth within the African horse sickness free zone. But then if we're talking about quarantine stations for movement internally, so movement into the controlled area, there are a number. They are all either within the Western Cape but outside of the controlled area, or there are 2 vector protected facilities or 3 vector facilities if you include the import quarantine station as well. Within Joburg, they are sort of lockdown type quarantines. But the short answer is that the list is available on our move@myhorse.org.za website. So the same website where you'd go to apply for a movement permit or to get your vaccination permissions or to get any information on African horse sickness control, as in legislative control, that same website has the list of currently registered facilities. So they do change. Obviously, people register and deregister based on their own facility demands and whatnot. And so it is important if you are going to move to make sure you are hoping to move to one that is currently registered. But the up-to-date list is kept on the website.
And that quarantine for the stopover is based on a 14-day quarantine, because a lot of people ask after the advent of the PCR test, why can't we just test a horse in the infected zone and bring it straight into the controlled zone if it tests negative? Good question, but the PCR test can only detect it when it's got the virus, and there's a 14-day incubation period for the virus, hence the 14-day quarantine.
And then another one from me. There's quite a few questions or more comments, kind of expressing cynicism over the efficacy of the vaccines. How effective are the vaccines? And maybe comments around the effectiveness of AHS1 or 2 only versus having both vaccines, and how that also develops as time goes. And then maybe lastly, I'm throwing a lot of questions in one here, but for older horses, a 20-year-old horse, for instance, would you still continue vaccinating a 20-year-old horse that's had a full vaccination record for decades?
That's a really good question, Vian, and I think I'll start it by saying, if we look at the horse industry in the endemic zone, if we didn't have the current vaccine that we have, I think I could safely say we probably wouldn't have a horse industry in the endemic zone. Now, that said, I'll let Camilla and John answer those more specific questions on the efficacy of the current vaccine and the cynicism around that, which I'm aware of, but I know they've got an answer to that.
Well, I'll start. No vaccine is going to be the silver bullet. It's especially in a disease where we have 9 separate serotypes. I think it's important to realize that immunity to African horse sickness is serotype specific. So your horse could develop a very good immunity to serotype 1, but then in your area, serotype 5 is circulating. And unfortunately, that is probably going to mean, if your horse has not got good serotype immunity to serotype 5, that you're not going to have as good an immune system towards that serotype. So the vaccine itself has got 7 of the 9 serotypes in it. Bottle 1 has got serotypes 1, 3, and 4, and bottle 2 has got serotypes 2, 6, 7, and 8 in it. So we don't have serotype 5 and we don't have serotype 9 in the vaccine for various reasons. Each of those serotypes has differing responses from the vaccine, or horses respond differently to each of those serotypes. There are some of the serotypes, for example, serotype 1, where almost across the board, horses will have good response to that serotype, and they will develop a good immunity to that serotype. There are other serotypes within that vaccine, like serotype 7, where the immunity is not that great for various reasons again. So it does depend on the serotype circulating within your area at the time. And what we have seen over the years is that this year in Gauteng, I'm giving it hypothetical, serotype 8 that is rife, and that is what we're seeing almost across the board. And then the next year, we won't see serotype 8, we'll see serotype 5. And then the next year, we'll see serotype 6 or serotype 4. So that's one of the reasons that you sometimes end up with horses with repeated vaccine or repeated infections over different years. I saw in one of the comments, why do they get one serotype, or why do they get horse sickness only once a season? It's probably because, and they don't get it over and over again, it's probably because there's only
Sorry, we've got a bad. I think we've lost Camilla again. So,
Yeah.
oh, Camilla, you back?
Am I back?
You're
Yeah,
back.
I'm back. Okay. So it's basically just that the immunity developed is serotype specific. So depending on what's circulating in your area is going to be dependent on how that vaccine respond or how your horse has responded. And then it's also unfortunately horse specific. You've got to remember that, as I said, there's 7 serotypes in that vaccine. You bombarding that horse with all 7 serotypes within normally a 6-week period, you are probably not going to get a great response to all 7 serotypes in one go. And it's one of the reasons that they say you should be vaccinating annually, is to try and to boost that immune system every year and hopefully get a more rounded antibody response from that horse. And your question then went on to go about, what about a 20-year-old horse? We don't have enough studies that have followed cohorts of horses over time to show whether their immune system remains the same, whether it declines. But what we do know from other vaccine studies is that there is a likelihood that after a certain number of immune doses, so vaccine doses, you hit a limit as to how high your vaccine or how high your immunity is likely to be, and you're probably not getting any more benefit. The problem is we don't know what that is for horse sickness, and it's likely completely different for every single horse. So each horse is going to have its own limit. So again, it would probably depend on the area you are in terms of what the risk of field viruses versus what the risk of not vaccinating is going to be. If you're in the controlled area and you're not really going anywhere and you've got a 20-year-old horse and you're maybe just going to protection zone and back, would I vaccinate that horse? No. If I was in the middle of Gauteng, yes, I probably would, because I'd be more scared of the field virus than I would be of the vaccine.
Okay, then there was just maybe a last question. We are running out of time, but just the rationale for the period of June to October for vaccinations. Is this, and I'll just read the question, is it based on the time required for optimal antibodies to develop by the time that the infection becomes a problem?
All right. Yeah, Leon, I try to answer that in the chat. Sorry, I am trying to answer those, but in the bottom line for that question is it's simply to do with the ecology of the vector and the ecology of the virus as well. So the vector populations are low in winter just because of the cold. So Kuda is just decreasing numbers as a rule in winter. But then even if they got infected with the virus, we know that African horse sickness virus and a lot of other viruses are very susceptible to cold. So the replication in the vector itself would take a lot longer and be at a lot lower levels. So the reason horse sickness is seasonal, and so in general, why we see it in summer and not in winter, is because of those factors. And so we use those same factors to help with managing this reversion to virulence and reassortment.
I can just maybe add that the specific June to October was obviously, and it was specifically looked at based on midge populations that we had, the information that we had at the time within the controlled area, which is also why it wasn't made a mandatory thing for the entire country, because every single area is going to have slightly different ecological conditions, and when the best winter months are and when the sort of highest risk times. It does differ within our country because we've got different ecological conditions, quite a lot of different ecological conditions within our own country. So that time period is a must for the controlled area and a recommendation for the rest of the country, so that you can actually work out a tailor-made, in the rest of the country where African horse sickness is an actual risk, you can make a tailor-made vaccination protocol based on the same principles, but maybe more specific to your area.
Yeah. In the old days, there actually used to be trade protocols that were seasonal trade protocols for diseases like horse sickness, but they no longer really exist. Yeah, because they're just too complicated to manage. But yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. I think we're getting towards 1:15, so let's cut things there. Just to reiterate, we have recorded this webinar, and we will be sharing that on our website and on the various social media channels. So it will be available afterwards. There's been a multitude of questions that we haven't got to, and from Kuda's side, we'll commit to circulating a document where we answer all these questions. And I think that would also include the presentations that Camilla referred to previously in terms of risk management over and above vaccines. So yeah, that just leaves me to say thank you so much for everyone who joined today. We really appreciate it. This is the first one, the first webinar of this kind that we're doing for our horse insurance business, and it's been wonderful to see so many people join. A huge thank you to the whole team from SAHP for your time, your insight, and just your continued commitment to protecting the South African equine industry. Thank you very much to the Kuda team that put us all together. In particular, Colleen, who's had many sleepless nights, and well done on putting this all together. And African horse sickness really is a shared challenge, and it requires shared responsibility. We hope today has helped clarify some of the complexities around protocols, around movement and around risk, and not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from an insurance point of view. At Kuda, we remain committed to working alongside the industry to manage risk responsibly and to support initiatives that ultimately help to keep our horses and our various equestrian sports safe. And we look forward to engaging further on this. As I said, we will be circulating the recording as well as a Q&A sheet if any more questions arise that you didn't think of during the session, please feel free to reach out to any one of the Kuda team, and and we'd love to include that in the Q&A session. So thank you very, very much for your time, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vian, and we're glad we could participate.
Thanks, guys.